She was tied to a tree, her back carved with the cruel words, Comanche lover blood dripping into the dirt, as riders vanished into the copper dusk. The forest held its breath, but one pair of eyes had seen everything a reclusive scout who had sworn never to care again. What happens when a man who buried his heart in war is forced to choose between silence and mercy? This story will take you into the brutal frontier where scars run deeper than flesh, and love itself becomes treason. Follow my story to the very end and comment the city you are watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let us begin. The sun was already sinking behind the scrub hills, turning the sky into a sheet of copper and shadow. The wind moved restless through the mesquite, cold and sharp cutting like whispers through dry branches. Horses stamped their hooves against the hard ground, snorting as if impatient with what their riders demanded. 5 men rode into the clearing. Their boots hit the frost-tipped earth with a crunch that felt like bones breaking. They dragged her from the saddle like a sack of grain limp. Silent hair, tangled wrists bound. She was no more than a girl, but life had already worn her down. Her dress was torn. Dust clung to the fabric. The back of it ripped open skin raw where rope had rubbed her thin arms. The youngest man, barely old enough to grow a beard, turned his face away. His voice cracked as he muttered, "That's enough." But the leader was not finished. He was taller, shoulders bent like they carried years of violence. A scar crossed his jaw, pale against skin tanned by merciless sun. His eyes were glassy empty, as if the world had long ago stolen whatever softness he might have had. He drew his knife, steel glinting dull in the fading light. The girl pressed her lips together, refusing to make a sound. The knife met her skin. Each stroke tore not only flesh, but dignity. When he stepped back, sweat on his brow, blood pooled where the blade had carved. The words, jagged, uneven, ugly, burned into her back, Comanche lover. One of the men spat in the dirt. "That'll send a message." To who, the young one asked, his voice thin. "She won't last the night." The leader shrugged, sliding the knife back into his belt. "To whoever finds her. To anyone thinking about spreading their legs for savages." And then just like that, they mounted their horses. Leather groaned, reins snapped, and they disappeared into the trees without looking back. But someone was watching. Hidden behind a thicket of juniper, crouched low with his rifle across his lap, Caleb Boone had seen it all. The wind carried the stench of leather, sweat, and iron to where he sat still as stone. He did not move. He did not even blink until the echo of hooves faded into nothing. Only then did he rise. For years, Caleb had lived alone in these hills, a man turned ghost. A former scout whose past was soaked in blood. Game avoided his scent. Neighbors forgot his name. He had learned to read shadows, to understand cruelty carved in red lines. And slowly, carefully, he approached the tree. The girl slumped forward, chin drooping, breath shallow but still there. Her lashes were clotted with dust and blood. Her lips cracked, her cheeks hollow from hunger. Caleb stopped just short, boots making no sound on the frozen ground. For a long moment, he simply stood tall, silent, staring at her. His hand twitched at his side, not for a weapon, but out of instinct. At last his voice cut the silence, low, cautious. "Can you hear me?" No answer. He stepped closer. The carved letters glistened wet in the last light of day. Whoever had done it knew how to make pain last. His jaw tightened. "Miss," he said again, voice firm. "Do you understand me?" This time her body twitched. A flicker. Her lips moved barely audible. One word, "Don't." Her knees buckled against the ropes. Her weight sagged, skin tearing where leather bit deep. Caleb's eyes stayed on her. Not with pity. Pity had no place in the frontier, but with something else. Something older. A memory stirring beneath the layers of grief and distance. He inhaled. The word carved into her back burned into his mind. Comanche lover. He had heard those words spat like poison before. It didn't matter if it was love survival or desperation. To the frontier, there was no difference. A woman like her would not be saved. She would be left, judged, forgotten. But here she was, still breathing, still bleeding. And for the first time in many years, Caleb Boone did not turn away. The sun slipped below the horizon. Darkness spread through the clearing, the tree standing like a gallows against the sky. Caleb knelt, his breath fogging in the cold air. His hand reached for the knife at his belt, an old cavalry blade, the grip worn smooth by time. He hesitated, staring at the engraving on the hilt. A name not his own. A name he had stopped saying long ago. He slid the blade carefully between rope and flesh. The girl flinched. "Easy," he murmured. "I'll be quick." The cord snapped one by one, and with the ropes gone, her strength left her too. She collapsed forward. Caleb caught her arms, instinctively cradling her weight. Her breath hitched against his neck, warm, wet, fragile. That was when he saw the word carved fully for the first time. Each letter jagged, angry. Each stroke meant to brand her forever. The blood was hers. But somehow, looking at it, Caleb felt his own past bleeding out too. The wars. The hatred. The nights by firelight when stories of traitor women were told like gospel. He had believed those stories once. He had repeated them. Now the truth sat heavy in his arms, a woman left to die because she had dared to love. He swallowed hard, tucked the knife back into its sheath, and without another word lifted her fully against his chest. The path home was long, the ridge cut by wind, the pines brittle with frost. But he carried her as though nothing else mattered. The cabin waited in the distance, silent, empty. A place of exile now called to something else, maybe the first fragile ember of mercy Caleb had felt in years. He walked on, and the night closed in behind him, hiding the oak tree, the rope scars, and the blood still wet in the dirt. The night had swallowed the hills whole by the time Caleb reached his cabin. The moon was only a faint silver coin behind clouds, its light barely enough to mark the trail. His arms ached, but he did not falter. The woman weighed less than she should have, like hunger itself had hollowed her bones. Every step he took was careful, steady, avoiding roots, shifting rocks, the hidden teeth of the wilderness. The cabin appeared at last, crouched in shadow beneath the ridge. A squat structure of logs weathered by storms and solitude. The door creaked when he pushed it open with his boot, carrying her inside as though she were glass that might shatter. The air smelled faintly of pine resin and old smoke. Juniper branches hung drying from the rafters. Shelves lined with jars of herbs stood against the wall dust, thick on their lids. It was not a home, it was a shelter carved out of loneliness. But tonight, it would have to be a refuge. Caleb laid her on the narrow cot in the corner, the wool blanket rough but clean. Her face was pale, lips cracked fever, already licking at the edges of her skin. She stirred faintly, mumbling words he could not catch. He knelt beside her, his hands scarred, calloused from years of holding rifles, knives, reins, moved slowly, almost awkwardly. He fetched water from the bucket near the stove, dampened a cloth, wiped blood from her back where the letters still wept crimson. Her body jerked once, a faint cry spilling from her throat. Caleb hushed her softly, though his voice felt alien in his own ears. "I know," he murmured. "It burns. But you're safe now. Safe." The word echoed bitter inside him. How many had he ever made safe? How many had he condemned instead? He shook the thought away and worked in silence, pressed salve onto her wounds, wrapped strips of linen across her back. Each stroke revealed more of what had been carved into her. Not just skin, but shame cruelty, the kind of hatred that marked deeper than blades. When he was finished, he sat back, breathing heavy. The fire in the stove had nearly died. He stirred the embers, coaxed them to glow again, feeding thin sticks until flames licked upward. The flicker of light painted the room in amber, painted her face too. She looked younger in the glow, though sorrow had aged her eyes even in unconsciousness. Caleb leaned against the wall, arms folded. He told himself he would only watch until dawn, only keep her alive through the fever. After that she would leave. She would have to. But the hours dragged on. The wolves howled somewhere in the distance, their cries long and mournful. Wind rattled the shutters like fingers knocking at the wood, and Caleb stayed awake. He remembered nights long ago when he had sat by another bed, his wife Anna coughing with a fever that never broke. The boy Jacob too young to understand why mother couldn't rise from her chair. He had watched them both fade, powerless, his hands as useless then as they had been deadly on battlefields. Now another life lay in front of him, fragile as a candle flame, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he would not let it go out. The woman stirred at last near dawn. Her eyes fluttered lashes sticky with sweat, her lips parted dry and cracked. She looked at him not with recognition, but with wild fear. Her voice rasped barely more than breath. Where am I? Caleb raised his hands, palms open, voice low. My cabin. You're safe. I cut you down. Her gaze darted around the room. Her breath quickened. She pushed weakly against the cot, trying to rise. No, she croaked, shaking her head. Not again. Not another man. Please. He caught her shoulders gently, keeping her from falling to the floor. Easy, he said. I won't hurt you. Her eyes locked on his wide, desperate. They all say that she whispered. The words pierced him deeper than any blade. He released her instantly, stepping back, letting her see the space between them. I won't touch you, he said, voice raw. Not unless you ask. She sagged back against the pillow, trembling, the fever still eating at her strength. Her hand crept to her back to the bandages. She winced when her fingers pressed the wound. Tears filled her eyes. Not loud sobs, just silent tears slipping down her cheeks. She turned her face away from him, ashamed of crying where he could see. Caleb looked at her a long moment. The fire popped in the stove, the only sound between them. At last he spoke. What's your name? Silence. Her lips parted, barely audible. Ellie. He nodded once. Ellie, that's yours. Not what they carved. Don't let them take that too. She blinked, surprised by the fierceness in his tone. Her breath hitched, but for the first time since she'd woken, she stopped shaking. Caleb turned to the fire again, crouching low, feeding it another stick. Behind him, Ellie's voice trembled out of the dark. Who are you? He stared into the flames. The answer stuck like a thorn in his throat. Caleb Boone, he said at last. Just a man who saw enough ghosts to know when one doesn't belong. The wind outside moaned. Inside, the silence stretched between them, not hostile now, but heavy with things neither dared yet to speak. Caleb leaned back against the wall, his rifle propped within reach, though his hand never touched it. Ellie closed her eyes, breath evening out slowly. Exhaustion dragging her under again. And Caleb, who had vowed never to guard another soul, kept his vigil as dawn seeped pale and fragile through the cracks in the shutters. The first light of morning broke cold and gray over the ridge. Frost clung to the grass outside, glittering faintly beneath a sky still bruised from the night. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, only faint orange embers glowing behind the iron grate. Caleb had not slept. He sat on the bench by the door, arms crossed over his chest, eyes heavy but unblinking. The woman on the cot stirred. Ellie's breath came shallow at first, her brow damp with sweat. Her lips parted in a groan, her fingers twitching against the rough wool blanket. Then her eyes fluttered open wide and wary. She looked around as though waking in a cage. Her body tensed instantly, muscles remembering fear before her mind caught up. Her gaze fell on him, and panic rushed across her face. Caleb did not move. He let her see his hands folded across his chest. The rifle leaned against the wall, untouched. His voice was steady, low. You're awake. Her throat worked dry as dust. She tried to sit up, groaning as pain tore down her back. Her hand clutched for something, anything, and landed on a broken piece of chair leg near the hearth. She gripped it like a weapon, raising it with trembling arms. Caleb rose slowly, palms open, careful not to startle her further. I'm not your enemy. Her eyes flashed. No one ever is. She rasped, her voice hoarse from fever and blood. The words landed heavy. He stopped standing still, allowing her the space she demanded. Her knuckles whitened around the chair leg. Her arms trembled, yet she held it between them like a barrier carved from fear. He nodded once. You're right, he said. That's what they say, and most of the time it's a lie. Her eyes narrowed. Which are you? For a moment, silence filled the room, thick as smoke. The only sound was the pop of a log collapsing into embers. Caleb let the question hang there, then answered in the blunt gravel tone of truth. I've killed men. Ellie's grip tightened. Her breath quickened. She flinched as if expecting the blow that usually followed such a confession. Caleb's gaze held hers unwavering. Not with pride, not with shame, just fact. I killed because I believed in something once. Then I kept killing because I didn't believe in anything at all. He let the words fall heavy. He wanted her to hear them. Wanted her to know that whatever mercy she found here was not born from some holy man's grace, but from the ashes of a sinner. Ellie swallowed, throat raw. Her voice trembled when she asked, Then why am I here? Caleb's jaw clenched. He turned slightly, looking at the fire, the light flickering across his scarred face. I didn't bring you here to hurt you, or to touch you, or to judge you. His voice lowered rough as sand through an old sieve. I brought you here because you were still breathing, and I couldn't walk away. Ellie's grip loosened on the wood. It slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor. Her chest rose and fell with the jagged rhythm of someone holding back more tears than words. Caleb did not step closer. Instead, he turned toward the kettle hanging above the fire. Steam hissed faintly from its spout. He poured hot water into a dented tin mug, dropped crushed herbs into the brew, and set it on the table within her reach. For the fever, he said simply. He didn't hand it to her, didn't try to coax her. He left it there and crossed to the far wall, sitting again with his back against the wood sewing needle and thread in his hand. He picked up a torn corner of the blanket she had thrown aside and began stitching slow and methodical, the way a man kept his hands busy when words had already been spent. Ellie watched him breathing shallow, clutching the blanket around herself. Her eyes flicked from the steaming cup to the steady movements of his hands. The silence stretched, but it was different now, less sharp, more uncertain. Finally, she reached for the mug. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it to her lips. The taste was bitter smoky, laced with ginger, but warmth spread down her throat, loosening the knot in her chest. She lowered it, staring into the fire. Her voice came soft, broken. You know my name. Caleb didn't look up from the blanket. Yes. Ellie. Not Comanche lover. Not the word carved in her flesh. Just Ellie. Her throat clenched. Her lips parted, but no words came. She turned her face away from him, eyes stinging, the flames blurring in her vision. The storm outside had quieted, but inside the cabin the silence spoke louder than any sermon. It was the silence of two lives scarred, stitched loosely together by truth and the faintest thread of trust. Ellie leaned back against the cot, sipping once more, the warmth easing the cold inside her. And for the first time in months, maybe years, she closed her eyes, not in fear, but in something close to safety. Caleb sat still against the wall, the thread pulling taut between his fingers, the fire casting his shadow across the room. And though he told himself this was only for a night that come morning, she would leave, deep down he knew this story had already begun to bind them both. The storm had passed, but in Ellie's mind, storms never truly ended. They lingered, flashes of memory, cutting through the dark voices, chasing her across the years. Sleep came shallow, broken. And when she woke, morning light pushed in pale through the cracks in the shutters, cold against her fevered skin. She turned her head, blinking hard. The cabin felt unfamiliar, still walls made of logs, shelves heavy with jars, the smell of herbs and pine smoke. She almost expected the masked men to burst in again to drag her back to the tree. Her body tensed. Across the room, Caleb sat sharpening his knife. The rasp of steel against stone filled the air, slow, steady, relentless. Her breath hitched. He noticed, looked up, and set the blade aside immediately. You're safe, he said again, quiet. The words sounded like they cost him something each time he said them. Ellie pulled the blanket closer. Her voice cracked. Safe doesn't exist. Caleb didn't argue. He only nodded once, as if he understood better than most. Then he rose, poured water into a tin cup, and placed it on the small table near her cot. Drink, he murmured. Not a command, not coaxing, just the offering of a man who had nothing else to give. She took it, sipping carefully. The water was cool, soothing, but her throat tightened all the same. She wanted to speak, but words felt dangerous, like they might betray her if she let them out. Caleb sat again this time, not sharpening, not stitching, just waiting. His silence pressed against her, not cruel, not comforting, just steady. At last she whispered, They'll come back. His eyes shifted toward her, sharp beneath his dark brow. Who, the men? Her voice wavered. They don't leave messages unless they want someone to read them. She turned her face to the wall, shame hot in her chest. They wanted everyone to know what I'd done. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice was low, careful. What did you do, Ellie? Her chest rose and fell unevenly. She swallowed, hard lips trembling, the words scraped out raw. I loved. Silence filled the cabin. The fire popped in the stove, breaking it for a heartbeat, then silence again. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Not with anger, not with judgment, but with something heavier, something old. Ellie pulled the blanket tighter. Her voice cracked as she continued each word, dragging memory into the open. I was taken during a raid. I thought they'd kill me. Everyone said they would. But there was a boy, a Comanche boy. She shut her eyes, remembering. His name was Tasso. The name lingered in the air like a prayer. He brought me water, bread, a blanket when nights turned cold. He didn't speak much English. I didn't speak his tongue, but he listened when I cried. Her lips trembled. He never touched me. Not once. Not the way men like them did. Caleb's fists tightened in his lap. His throat worked, but he said nothing. Ellie's eyes glistened. She forced the words out. One night he showed me a scar on his chest shaped like a horseshoe. He said, soldier. Then he touched his heart and shook his head. Not soldier. And then, her voice broke into a whisper. He kissed me, and I didn't pull away. The fire crackled. The wind outside moaned low through the cracks. Caleb stared at her silent, as though carved from stone. His jaw clenched, breath shallow. Memories clawed at him, campfires on cold nights, men telling stories of girls who betrayed their kind men, who said those girls deserved to hang. He had nodded back then, believed it. He had carried a knife that wrote those beliefs into flesh. Now looking at Ellie, he saw not a traitor, but a woman broken open by love. She wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. They found us in his tent when the soldiers came. I was wrapped in his blanket, holding his shirt. They didn't ask questions, they just dragged me out. I screamed his name, but her voice collapsed, tears finally spilling. He never answered. I don't even know if he lived through that dawn. Caleb turned his face away, staring into the flames. For the first time in years, his chest ached with something he couldn't bury. He had seen that kind of dawn rifles cracking tents, burning young men dying without names. How many Tassos had he left lying in the dirt? Ellie's shoulders shook. When I came back, I thought they'd be glad I survived, but they looked at me like I was filth. The preacher's wife wouldn't give me bread. My childhood friend crossed the street to avoid me, and when whispers spread that I carried a child, the hate sharpened. Caleb shut his eyes, exhaling slow. Her words cut deep, each one slicing into the rotten fabric of what he'd once believed. Ellie pressed her hand to her stomach, flat now hollow, as if memory alone still burned there. Her voice broke. They didn't see love. They didn't see a boy who saved me. They only saw betrayal. And they carved it into me so no one would forget. The room swam with silence. Caleb finally looked back at her. His eyes were dark, haunted, but there was no judgment, only a man staring at the mirror of his own sins. He rose slowly, the bench creaking beneath him. He crossed to the stove, his back to her, his shoulders tight. His voice was barely more than a whisper. They should have left you alone. The words cracked like dry wood. Ellie froze, blinking through tears. For the first time since the tree, someone had said it, what she had begged silently to hear. Caleb leaned his hand against the wall, his head bowed. His chest rose heavy with the weight of too many ghosts. He could almost see their faces again. Anna, Jacob, the ones he buried, the ones he slaughtered. And now Ellie, alive against all odds, asking him not for pity, but for recognition. The knife on the table gleamed faint in the firelight. He stared at it a long while, then turned back to her eyes, tired voice steady. You'll stay until you heal. After that, he trailed off, unable to finish. Because deep down, he already knew this story wasn't finished. Not for him. Not for her. Ellie lowered her head, clutching the blanket. She whispered, why Caleb's eyes burned with something like confession. Because if I let you die out there, I'll never bury what's left of me. The fire crackled. The wind sighed through the shutters. And in that silence, two lives scarred by the frontier began, however faintly, to bind together. The fire had burned down to embers again. Gray light crept through the cracks of the shutters, carrying with it the smell of frost and pine. Caleb sat hunched at the table, the old cavalry knife lying in front of him. He turned it slowly in his hands, the steel catching dull glints of light. The hilt was worn smooth, the engraving faded, but every mark carried memory. Ellie lay still on the cot, eyes half closed, but not asleep. Her body throbbed with fever, but her mind was sharper now, dragged back to the cruel present. Her voice was hoarse when she asked, That knife, how long have you carried it? Caleb didn't look up. Too long. She shifted under the blanket, grimacing at the pull across her back. You've used it. His jaw tightened. He turned the blade once more before setting it flat on the wood. I carved messages into the world with it. Messages I thought were justice. Ellie's eyes lingered on the weapon. Her breath came shallow. What kind of messages? Caleb finally met her gaze. The lines on his face deepened the weight of years pressing through. Names, warnings. Sometimes no words at all, just blood. We told ourselves it was righteous, that we were cleansing the land. But truth is, his voice trailed ragged. We were carving pain into people who'd already known enough of it. Silence stretched. Ellie closed her eyes, pain and recognition stirring together. When she spoke again, her voice trembled. They did the same to me. Their knife. Your knife. Maybe not yours in hand, but the same steel, the same hate. Caleb inhaled sharply, chest heavy. The truth of her words cut deeper than any blade. He leaned back, running a hand down his face. For the first time in years, shame rose in him like bile. He looked at her not as a wounded woman, not as some outcast marked by whispers, but as proof. Proof of what his kind of vengeance had done. Ellie turned her face toward the fire. Her voice softened, but every word pierced. They called me Comanche lover, as if love were the worst crime a woman could commit. They didn't care if it was kindness, survival, or truth. They only cared that I came back different, and for that they wanted me gone. Her hand trembled as she touched the bandages across her back. I'll carry their word forever, just like you carry yours. Caleb's throat worked, but no sound came. He stared at her, then at the knife, and for the first time in years he felt the full weight of the scars he had left behind on others. He rose, pacing the length of the small cabin. His boots scuffed the floor, each step restless, searching. Finally, he stopped by the window, staring out at the pale morning. My wife's name was Anna, he said, voice breaking through the quiet. She liked peach pie. Couldn't sew a damn thing straight. But her laugh. He closed his eyes as if he could hear it. It scared birds off the fence. Ellie blinked, startled by the softness in his tone. My boy Jacob Caleb continued. 3 years old. Thought horses were dragons. I buried them both with my hands after a raid. And when the dirt closed over them, something inside me broke. He turned back, eyes shadowed. After that, I picked up this knife and carved every name I could find into the earth. Comanche, Kiowa. It didn't matter. I told myself it was justice. But it wasn't. It was just hurt. Passed from one set of hands to another. Ellie swallowed her own pain reflected in his. Her voice was steady, though tears glistened in her eyes. And what do you see now? Caleb's gaze held hers. I see that carving pain into you didn't stop mine. It only added to it. The fire cracked sharply in the stove, as if punctuating the words. Ellie drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders, trembling not from fever, but from the echo of what had been spoken. You once would have left me, she said quietly. Maybe even joined them. Caleb didn't deny it. His silence was admission enough. But you didn't, she whispered almost to herself. You cut me down. You carried me. He stepped closer to the cot, not too close, just enough to meet her eyes without shadow. I don't know if that makes me better than I was, he said, but it's the first thing I've done in years that didn't feel like killing. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Instead, she looked into the flames, her face pale but calm, as though she too recognized that something had shifted. The morning outside brightened, frost melting into dew, and inside the cabin 2 broken lives, one scarred by loss, the other branded by cruelty, sat in the fragile stillness of truth. Neither trusted it fully, neither dared name it, but both knew the knife on the table was no longer the sharpest thing between them. The day dragged slow, the kind of day where time itself seemed to hesitate at the edges of silence. Light shifted across the cabin walls, turning from silver morning to dull afternoon, never once softening the weight inside. Caleb sat near the stove, sharpening a hatchet now, though the edge barely needed it. It was habit, something to keep his hands busy while his mind twisted with ghosts. Ellie lay on the cot, eyes open, watching the thin trail of smoke curl toward the rafters. Her body throbbed with fever, less than before, but the wounds on her back seared every time she moved. She wanted to speak to fill the silence, yet her tongue felt heavy with all the words others had tried to strip from her. Finally, her voice broke the quiet. "You said you buried your family with your own hands." Caleb's shoulders stiffened. His hand froze mid-stroke on the hatchet. He lowered the blade, setting it aside slowly like a man laying down a weapon he no longer trusted. "Yes." The word came raw. Ellie swallowed, her throat aching. "Then you know what it's like, to have the world carve something out of you and leave the hole gaping." He turned toward her, eyes shadowed. "I know." Her breath caught. For a moment she felt less alone. And yet the truth pressed against her ribs like thorns. "They didn't just carve it out of me," she whispered. "They branded me with it. So even if I walk, even if I breathe, I'll never be more than the word on my back." Caleb stepped closer, leaning against the table, arms crossed. His gaze didn't waver. "They think pain lasts forever because they've never carried it as long as you have. The scars don't make you theirs. They make you yours." Ellie's eyes filled, but no tears fell. She hated crying. She hated how it made her feel like they had won. But his words burrowed deeper than she wanted them to. Her voice came sharp, defensive. "And what about you? Do your scars make you yours?" Caleb's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his voice rumbled low, almost like gravel dragged across stone. "No. They made me theirs. Every scar, every kill, every knife mark. I carried hate that wasn't mine to begin with. I let it turn me into a man who thought vengeance was holy." Ellie studied him. Her heart thudded heavy. "You'd have killed me once." The words hung sharp in the air. Caleb did not flinch. "Yes." The honesty startled her more than a denial ever could. His eyes burned with something closer to confession than regret. "I'd have called you a traitor, said you deserved what they carved. Maybe I'd have left you tied there myself." Her stomach churned, shame and fury battling inside her. Yet there was no malice in his tone, only a brutal truth, the kind that wounds then forces you to see. He drew in a breath, chest rising like he carried a stone. "But I didn't," he said quietly. "And I won't. Not now. Not again." Ellie's hands trembled where they clutched the blanket. She wanted to hate him for what he admitted, but some strange part of her believed him more for saying it plain. She whispered, "Why me?" His eyes softened only slightly. "Because I'm tired of being death's shadow. Because you remind me that mercy still exists, even if it hurts to look at it." Silence stretched between them, thick and unsteady. The fire hissed low, the room flickering with restless shadows. Ellie turned her face away, blinking hard. Her voice was almost too soft to hear. "Tasso said I wasn't a thing. He said I was someone's sky. That's why he saved me." Caleb swallowed hard, the words lodging deep in his chest. He thought of Anna, of Jacob, of the way he had once seen the world through their laughter. Once long ago, he too had believed someone could be more than the scars carved into them. He crossed the room, crouching near her cot, though he didn't reach for her. He kept his distance, his voice steady. "They tried to erase you. They failed. I see you, Ellie. Not their word, not their hate, just you." Her breath caught. Her lips trembled. She shut her eyes, clutching the blanket tighter, as if holding the fragile truth against her skin. For the first time since the night beneath the oak, she felt the faintest spark of something other than fear. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. The wind outside rattled the shutters, the fire burned low. And in the heart of the wilderness, two broken lives sat in the silence, no longer strangers, but not yet saved. Caleb rose, standing tall, his voice rough as he glanced once more at the knife on the table. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go back to the tree." Ellie's eyes opened sharp with alarm. Why? He met her gaze steady as stone. "Because I won't carry this steel another day. It's time to bury the knife." Dawn broke slow the next morning, thin light leaking across the ridges like a secret too tired to keep itself hidden. The frost on the grass glimmered, melting into dew with every cautious touch of sun. Inside the cabin, Caleb moved quietly, packing his saddlebag with what little they'd need. Ellie watched from the cot, her body stiff with ache, though the fever had loosened its grip. She tried to rise, groaning as the bandages pulled tight across her back. Caleb turned at once. Not yet. You're still healing. Her chin lifted stubbornly. You said we were going back to the tree. Then I'm going. For a moment, silence stood thick between them. Caleb's jaw worked as though he wanted to argue, but he saw something in her eyes, a fire that refused to die no matter what had been carved into her. He gave a single reluctant nod. Then you'll ride. But slow. And I won't have you fall. He fetched his horse from the lean-to outside a broad-chested bay gelding with a scar along his flank. The animal stamped steam rising from its nostrils. Ellie stared at the saddle, her heart quickening. It had been months since she'd ridden, since before the whispers and the rope. Caleb helped her mount, careful his touch, fleeting his eyes, never meeting hers. She sat stiffly, clutching the pommel as if it were the last piece of earth she trusted. They set out. The trail wound through brittle pines and brush, the ground hard beneath hooves. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of smoke from somewhere distant, maybe another camp. Maybe just the ghost of one Caleb had burned long ago. Neither spoke for the first miles. Ellie's breath came shallow, every jolt of the horse sending pain rippling through her back. But she held steady, refusing to show weakness. At last she whispered, "You buried your family here, didn't you? In these hills?" Caleb's hands tightened on the reins, his eyes stayed forward. Yes. The word dropped heavy like a stone into still water. Ellie's throat ached. She wanted to ask more, but something in his silence warned her off. Instead, she looked at the horizon, the endless sprawl of plains stretching wide, wild, unforgiving. It made her feel small but also free, like there was still room for something new to grow. When they reached the clearing, her breath stopped. The oak stood the same as when they had left it. Roots knotted deep bark, rough and scarred the tree, a sentinel of cruelty. The faint rope marks were still visible. The dirt still bore the shadow of what had been done. Ellie's stomach turned. Her hands shook on the reins. Caleb dismounted, first steady, then reached up. She hesitated, staring down at his outstretched hand. For a heartbeat, fear flared, memories of hands grabbing, dragging, cutting. But his eyes held steady, patient. Slowly she placed her hand in his, and he helped her to the ground. They stood side by side before the tree. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying no mercy. Caleb pulled the knife from his belt. The same knife he'd carried for years. The same knife that had fed him, fought for him, killed for him. Its steel gleamed dull in the pale light. He turned it in his hand, eyes fixed on the blade as though staring into his own reflection. "This knife kept me alive," he said, voice low. "It also carved hate into the world. Hate I carried. Hate I gave." Ellie's breath came ragged. Her gaze locked on the steel, remembering the sting of it against her skin, the letters carved without mercy. Her chest rose and fell shallow, unsteady. Caleb knelt at the base of the oak. The ground was hard resistant, but he dug anyway, fingers clawing at the cold dirt until blood welled in the creases of his knuckles. The hole grew slowly, deep enough to swallow more than steel, deep enough to swallow years. He paused, holding the knife once more. His hands trembled. "I don't bury this because I regret all I've done," he murmured. "I bury it because I won't add another name to what it remembers." His voice cracked gravel, breaking under weight. "I bury it because I want to choose something else." He pressed the blade into the earth, covered it with soil handful by handful, each motion like stripping chains from his chest. When it was done, he sat back on his heels, breath ragged. Ellie stepped closer. Her eyes lingered on the mound of fresh dirt. Her hand trembled as she laid it gently over his. Her voice was soft but firm. "Then let it stay buried." Caleb lifted his head, meeting her gaze. For the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only truth, and perhaps in the faintest glimmer, forgiveness. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage through the clearing. The tree loomed above them, but its shadow felt lighter now, as if something old had loosened its grip. Caleb rose slowly, offering Ellie his arm. She hesitated again, then took it. Not out of weakness, not out of need, but as if choosing to stand beside him. They turned together toward the trail, leaving the buried knife behind. Neither spoke, but both knew the act had changed more than the earth. It had changed them. And though the past could never be undone for the first time since war and whispers and blood, Caleb Boone and Ellie Kane stepped away from the oak, not as ghosts, but as people still alive. They rode home without speaking, a silence heavy as saddlebags full of words neither dared touch. The frost cracked beneath the bay gelding's hooves, each step snapping the earth's brittle crust. By the time the cabin squatted into view, Ellie's hands were stiff with cold and her back burned under the bandage with every sway of the saddle. She did not ask him to stop. Pain was a language she already spoke. Caleb swung down first. He didn't lay a hand on her until she gave the smallest nod, and then he steadied her with a grip so light it almost wasn't there. Inside he coaxed the stove awake, fed it resin that snapped fast into flame. Smoke curled sweet into the rafters. He set a kettle to boil, dropped herbs into the water, then laid dried venison and hominy in a pan. They moved around each other like dancers who'd rehearsed the same lonely steps, quiet, precise. Careful not to jar what little peace there was. No clatter, no boasts, only the scrape of a spoon, the soft tear of cloth as he checked her bandage, the hiss of meat surrendering to heat. When he was finished, he sat. Not too near, not far. The knife was gone now, buried under the oak, the earth holding it like a grave, keeps secrets. Ellie watched the flames stitch themselves higher in the grate. Her voice when it came was steady, as if she'd sanded it smooth on the trail. In town, she said, they kept me 2 nights. Caleb's eyes lifted. He didn't interrupt. The sheriff said it was for my safety. She breathed once bitter. Men waited outside shouting, safety. The word rattled sharp in her mouth. They put me in the back cell. No blanket the first night, a bucket a cup that stank of whiskey. The deputy slid bread through the bars without looking at me. Her gaze burned into the wall. The women were worse. The ones who once called me Ellie Girl when I was small. They came to stare. One said I'd brought Indian seed into the Lord's house. She said it loud so the men would hear. Caleb's jaw locked. He didn't look down at his hands for fear of seeing them close. They came that night, Ellie said. Scarves over their faces, rope in their fists, though I was already behind iron. One shoved a hand through the bars, grabbed my hair, yanked so hard I thought my scalp would tear. Another slipped the rope around my shoulders, cinched it, laughed when I gasped for air. They didn't mean to kill me. Not yet, just to prove they could. Her fingers picked at the blanket's edge, knuckles white. A boot came through next, slammed my belly. Her palm pressed flat to her stomach, instinctive. I didn't know for certain, but afterward I felt something change, like a door shutting on a room I'd never enter again. Caleb leaned forward, voice rough. What did the deputy do? He told them it was enough. Her laugh was a dry crack. They said it was the Lord's work, asked if he meant to stand against the Lord. So he stepped back 5 feet and let the Lord kick me again. The lamp hummed, the wind combed the trees. Nothing shifted. I bled. The next morning, she whispered, all at once as though my body had waited for permission. No one came when I called. I tore my petticoat into rags. It wasn't enough. I lay on the floor counting the slats in the ceiling until the counting sounded like bells, and then nothing at all. Her eyes shone, but tears refused. The land had a way of stealing water before it fell. Caleb's throat scraped. You lost him. Or her. I'll never know. Her lips trembled, then steadied. I would have named the child Jonah if it was a boy. Or Joseph. Something soft. A name with a place to rest. She shook her head once. When they released me, the preacher's wife left a cake on my father's steps and called it mercy. I dropped it in the pig trough and watched the sow nose it into mud. The kettle hissed. Caleb poured hands needing work to remember they weren't only for hurting. He set the cup within reach. She stared at it before lifting it, sipping the heat spreading slow through her chest. Caleb sat again, voice low. I rode with a captain out of Fort Elliott. We were told warriors waited in the draw. We found families. His words had no color. Color would make it a tale, and tales could be forgiven. We burned hides, drove off ponies. A woman ran with a child strapped to her back and a boy clinging to her hand. She didn't look at us till she reached the creek. Then she put herself behind them chin high like a fence post in floodwater. His hands curled empty. We fired because the man on the left fired. The boy fell first. I remember the sound most of all, like a branch breaking under snow and then deciding against it. Ellie's eyes met his and didn't flinch. It wasn't the only time, Caleb said. A canyon once. Red walls dry as salt. We cut what we couldn't carry. Someone pointed at tracks too small for men. I said coyotes. We all said coyotes. The canyon believed us. It had no tongue to argue. Silence swelled heavy as hoofprints filled with rain. I judged you, he admitted. I judged every woman whose grief didn't look like mine. I let hate pretend it mattered. And now, her voice was not kind, not cruel, just the weight of a question. Now I don't want to know hate anymore. He let the words stand crooked, unsteady. I'm not asking forgiveness. I can't. I'm only telling you that once I'd have tied you to that tree. Today I buried the knife. Ellie drank from the cup because warmth is sometimes the only shield when memory turns the air to ice. She set it down, both hands steady. I hear you, she said softly. I don't know what to do with it yet, but I hear you. Caleb nodded, breath catching like it wanted to turn into something else, relief maybe. The venison hissed in the pan, then went still. He slid her a bowl. She ate slow each bite, a small declaration, I am still here. Later he filled a basin with warm water, carried a clean cloth, paused outside her shadow, lifted an eyebrow question only. She nodded. He knelt behind her, unwound the bandage inch by inch. The letters were swollen raw but clean. He pressed the cloth to her back, steady hands making themselves steady. Ellie sucked in air, then released it. It's worse at night, she whispered, when the room is quiet enough for the word to speak itself. It isn't its name, Caleb said. It's a wound. She nodded faintly. He laid fresh linen, tied it secure, sat back on his heels like a man who had just said a prayer he didn't know the words for. You should sleep, he said. If I do, she murmured, I'll see the jail again. Then see something else, he answered before he could stop. See sage growing where the knife is buried. See a boy running who never learns that word. See tomorrow. Her lips twitched toward something that almost remembered smiling. Do you think it's possible? He swallowed. I think planting is harder than shooting. And I think I finally got the hands for the harder thing. The wind shifted. The fire sank low. And for the first time in years, Caleb Boone sat not as a soldier or a shadow, but as a man who chose to keep watch over the door between the night and the woman who had begun to teach him mercy. The following days blurred into a rhythm neither of them had expected. Not peace exactly, but something that carried its own fragile shape. The cabin breathed with small sounds, now Ellie stirring the pot, Caleb cutting wood, the creak of the rocker by the fire, when neither of them could sleep. It was life stretched thin, stitched together with silence and necessity. Each morning Caleb checked her bandages. The wounds healed slower than he wanted, angry red ridges puckering against her pale skin. Ellie clenched her jaw every time the linen pulled away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a cry. He never commented on her stubbornness, but the set of his mouth told her he saw it. By the third day, she could walk across the cabin without clutching the wall. She moved stiff, her back screaming at each step, but she moved. When she reached the shelf and lifted a jar of dried beans, Caleb started forward, ready to take it. She turned, met his gaze, and shook her head. I can, she said. He stopped, then nodded, stepping back. That night, as wind rattled the shutters, Ellie sat cross-legged by the fire, sewing a torn hem of her dress, with thread she'd begged from him. Her fingers trembled, unused to work so steady after months of survival. Caleb sat opposite, watching her in silence, his hands wrapped around a mug of bitter chicory brew. She glanced up, once catching his eyes. What are you staring at? Your hands. The answer slipped out before he could catch it, her brow furrowed. My hands. He nodded slowly. They're still working, after everything. Most people would have let them curl into fists, her breath caught. For a moment she forgot to move the needle. Then she dropped her gaze back to the cloth, stitching in silence. When she spoke again, her voice was low. They tried to make me less than I was, but every stitch I sew is mine. Every breath is mine. They don't get to keep it. Caleb's throat tightened. He leaned back, staring into the flames. They tried the same with me, he admitted. Told me killing made me righteous. I believed them. I let them hollow me out until I was nothing but a blade waiting to be used. Ellie looked up, her eyes reflecting firelight. And now his gaze lingered on the coals. Now I'd rather build a fence crooked than cut one more soul straight out of the world. The room quieted again, but not empty. It felt like the pause between two breaths, fragile waiting. Later, when the fire sank low, Ellie lay on the cot staring at the ceiling beams. Her voice drifted into the dark. Tusso said once that I was not a thing, that I was someone's sky. Caleb sat in the rocker half dozing, but his eyes opened at the sound. Sky. She nodded faintly. It meant something to him. Maybe it meant freedom. Maybe it meant I was worth looking up to. Her lips trembled. No one has called me that since. The rocker creaked as Caleb leaned forward. I'm not a man for fancy words, he said, rough, but steady. But if he saw a sky in you, then he was right. They carved their word into your back, but it doesn't cover what's already written in your bones. Her eyes stung. She turned her face to the wall, afraid to let him see the wetness gathering. But in the silence that followed, she breathed easier than she had in months. The next morning, footsteps approached the cabin. Caleb heard them before Ellie did, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the faint clink of spurs. He rose without a word, taking the rifle from its place against the wall. Ellie froze where she sat, her hand clutching the edge of the blanket. Who is it? Caleb moved to the door, his body angled so she could not see the tension in his jaw. Stay back, he muttered. The knock came 3 firm raps that echoed through the cabin like judgment. Caleb opened the door to find 2 men standing there, dust coats, wide-brimmed hats, rifles slung across their backs. The older one tipped his hat in mock courtesy. Morning, Boone. Sheriff wants a word. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Sheriff knows where I live. If he wants a word, he can come himself. The younger man spat into the dirt. He sent us instead. Word spreading, folks say the girl's alive. Folks say you're harboring her. Caleb felt Ellie stiffen behind him. He did not look back. His voice dropped quiet but edged. She's not their concern anymore. The older man's smile thinned. Everything's the town's concern if the sheriff says so. You know that. His eyes flicked over Caleb's shoulder toward the faint figure in the shadows. Bring her out. Let her answer for herself. Ellie's breath hitched. Her nails dug into the blanket. Caleb stepped forward, blocking the view entirely. His voice rumbled low as thunder. She's not answering to you. Not now. Not ever. The 2 men exchanged glances. One shifted uneasily. The other sneered, but the sneer didn't reach his eyes. We'll be back, the older one muttered, spitting into the frost. They turned their boots, crunching hard against the trail as they walked away. Caleb shut the door slow, the wood groaning. He set the rifle back against the wall, his shoulders still tight. Ellie stared at him, her face pale, her body shaking. They'll come. All of them. They won't stop. Caleb met her eyes, the firelight catching the hard line of his jaw. Then we don't stop either. She swallowed hard. What do you mean? He stepped closer, his voice steady, unflinching. I mean, when they come for you, they'll have to come through me. Ellie's breath caught. Her heart pounded with fear and something else she hadn't felt in months, a flicker of safety. And though the cabin still shook with the echo of boots fading into the distance, she knew this fight was far from over. The threat hung in the air long after the men's boots had faded into the trees. The cabin felt smaller walls pressing in the fire too loud, every shadow too close. Ellie sat stiff on the cot, her hands gripping the blanket until her knuckles burned white. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on nothing, though every muscle in him was taut as bowstring. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. They won't wait long. Caleb's jaw worked. No, they won't. Her throat tightened. Then maybe I should go. If they don't find me here, they'll leave you be. His head snapped toward her, eyes burning. You think walking out there alone is safety? You'd last an hour before they strung you up again. Maybe less. She flinched at his tone, but her chin lifted stubborn even through fear. I won't have you killed for me. Caleb pushed off the wall, pacing once across the floor. His boots thudded heavy, the sound of a man wrestling with ghosts. He stopped at the stove, one hand braced on the mantel, the other curling into a fist. Ellie, he said, his voice raw. If I let them take you, then I'm no better than the men who tied you to that tree. I buried the knife because I'm done being their shadow, but I'll damn well stand in front of you if they try again." Her breath shuddered. The words lodged deep, tangled with something sharp and unfamiliar: hope. Silence stretched. The fire hissed logs shifting in the grate. At last Ellie whispered, "Then what do we do?" Caleb turned, his face drawn but steady. "We wait. We hold. And when they come, we show them truth." Ellie frowned, fear stirring. "Truth doesn't stop bullets." "No," he admitted, "but it can stop men from pulling the trigger." That evening the wind carried a different sound. Distant hooves too many to mistake for travelers. Ellie froze at the window, clutching the sill with trembling hands. Caleb joined, her eyes narrowing as dust rose against the dimming sky. 11 riders, hard faces, rifles, strapped dusters flapping like wings of judgment. He pulled the rifle from the wall and set it by the door. But he didn't load it. Didn't chamber a round. Ellie's voice shook. You're not going to fight them." Caleb shook his head. "I've fought enough ghosts." He looked at her gaze, steady, fierce. "This time I'll stand. But not with blood." The hoofbeats grew louder. The cabin walls seemed to pulse with each thud, the ground trembling under their weight. Ellie's stomach turned, but when Caleb opened the door and stepped outside, she followed. The riders reined in, hard dust swirling. At their head sat Sheriff Mark Hensley, his badge dulled, his face shadowed by guilt. He eyed Caleb first, then Ellie, his jaw set. "We're here for her," the sheriff said. Caleb crossed his arms bare against the cold. "You're late." A murmur stirred among the men. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "She's accused of consorting, of treason. You know what she is." Caleb's voice cut sharp. "She was left to die tied to a tree. If that's justice now, then you've lost the word's meaning." The men shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Ellie stepped forward, shawl wrapped tight, her spine straight, despite the tremble in her hands. She met their eyes without flinching. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you come quietly, we won't harm you." Caleb's voice thundered low. "She has nothing to confess but love, and if that's a crime, then I'm guilty too." Gasps rippled through the riders. The sheriff's gaze snapped to him. You, Caleb, gave one slow nod. "She's not just the Comanche's lover now, she's mine." The words fell heavy, cutting through the clearing like steel. The riders stilled, eyes wide, some with shock, some with recognition. One old gray-bearded man leaned forward in his saddle, squinting. "Is that Boone?" The name passed through the line like wildfire. Whispers followed. Caleb Boone, the scout, the ghost of the wars, the man who carved 20 dead into the dirt outside Palo Duro. Men shifted spines, straightening, shame flickering behind hardened eyes. The sheriff's jaw worked. At last he leaned forward in his saddle, voice tight. "You willing to fight for her?" Caleb's answer came without hesitation, steady as stone. "I'm willing to live for her. That's harder." The clearing fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on every man present. Ellie's hand slid into Caleb's, trembling but sure. Her voice rang out strong despite scars. "I never betrayed this land. I only loved where I wasn't allowed. If that's a sin, then you've all sinned too." The riders shifted eyes, dropping rifles heavy in their hands but unmoving. One by one, shame bent their spines, and the barrels pointed not at her but toward the ground. The sheriff lingered last, his eyes dark with something caught between anger and understanding. He tipped his hat, the motion slow, reluctant. Then he turned his horse. The others followed, dust swallowing them as they disappeared into the trees. Ellie stood still, her body trembling, her hand clenched tight in Caleb's. The clearing rang with silence, louder than any gunshot. Neither spoke. Neither moved. But they both knew the war wasn't over. Not with the world, but maybe for the first time with themselves. The riders' dust still hung in the trees when Ellie finally exhaled. Her knees threatened to give the weight of what had just happened, pressing down as heavy as the ropes once had. But Caleb's hand didn't let hers fall. He stood rooted beside her, his jaw set, watching the trail where the sheriff had disappeared. "They'll be back," Ellie whispered. Caleb's eyes remained on the horizon. "Yes, but not tonight." The words were simple, steady, but they carried the gravity of a man who had seen entire winters of war. He led her back inside, shut the door, and dropped the iron latch into place. The fire was low again, embers glowing faint against the stove's black mouth. Ellie sat heavily on the cot, her body trembling as though the sheriff had left his hands on her shoulders. Caleb crouched at the stove, feeding it fresh wood. When the flames rose, he turned to her, the firelight carving hard lines across his face. "You stood," he said, voice quiet but fierce. "They saw it. Every one of them." Her lips trembled. "Do you think it matters?" He sat back against the wall, arms crossed. "It matters to me." The words caught her off guard. She looked away, blinking fast, as if embarrassed by the heat rising in her chest. Later that night she dreamed. She was back beneath the oak ropes, burning into her wrists, the word bleeding across her back. But this time it wasn't the masked men with knives. It was the townsfolk, the preacher's wife, her childhood friend, the deputy who'd stepped aside. They pressed the blade together, a chorus of betrayal. "Traitor," they whispered. "Comanche lover." She jerked awake, gasping, clutching at the blanket. The room was dark except for the faint glow of coals. Her breath came fast, ragged. A shadow stirred in the corner. Caleb's voice rumbled low. "It's all right." Her eyes darted toward him. He hadn't slept. He sat on the bench near the door, rifle within reach but untouched. His posture was steady, his presence solid as the logs that held the cabin together. Ellie pressed her palms to her eyes, breath hitching. "They won't let me live." "Not really. Not as I am." Caleb's voice was rough like stone, dragged across stone. "Then we'll show them who you are, not what they call you." Her hands dropped, her gaze meeting his. "And who am I?" For a moment, silence stretched, heavy, unflinching. Then Caleb's answer came steady, sure. "You're Ellie Kane, not their word, not mine, yours." Her throat closed around the weight of it. She turned away, but the tears came anyway, silent tracks down her cheeks. The next morning, the world outside was softer, the storm cloud's broken light spilling gold across the frost. Ellie stepped out into the yard for the first time since the tree. The air bit at her lungs, but it felt clean, alive. Caleb stood near the woodpile, splitting logs with a single steady rhythm. Each swing of the axe cracked through the quiet like a heartbeat. She watched him a long while, her arms wrapped tight around herself. There was violence in the movement, yes, but there was also control, discipline. Every cut of the blade went into wood, not flesh, and somehow that difference mattered. When he noticed her, he paused, leaning on the axe. "You shouldn't be out in the cold," he said. "I need to breathe air that isn't smoke and fever," she replied. He studied her, then nodded once. "All right, but stay close." Her eyes scanned the ridges, the forest beyond. Every shadow looked like it might birth riders again, men with ropes and knives. But beside Caleb she stayed. That evening she asked him something she had not dared before. "Why didn't you load your rifle when they came?" He was mending the strap of his saddle, his hand steady over the leather. He didn't look up. "Because if I had, I would have fired. And if I'd fired, there'd be blood on the ground again." "I buried the knife, Ellie. The gun's no different." She studied him, her voice trembling. "Then what if they come with theirs already drawn?" He lifted his head at that, his gaze meeting hers with a fire she hadn't seen before. "Then I'll stand unarmed, and if they still shoot, let them live with the shame of it. I've lived long enough with mine." Her chest ached at his words. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe the world could be swayed by truth. But the memory of rope and knives whispered otherwise. She turned toward the fire, hugging the shawl tighter. Her voice was quiet, almost breaking. "Promise me if it comes to it. Promise you won't let them carve me again." Caleb's breath slowed. He set the leather aside, rose, and crossed the room. He stood before her, tall, worn, a man remade by ghosts. His hand hovered near her shoulder but didn't touch. "I promise," he said. "Not while I breathe." Ellie closed her eyes, letting the words settle over her like a blanket she hadn't known she needed. Outside, the wind picked up again. But inside the cabin, for the first time in years, both Caleb Boone and Ellie Kane felt something close to shelter. Not safety, not peace, but the beginning of it. The frost lay thick across the hills that morning, crunching under boots and hooves alike. Caleb stood outside the cabin, arms folded, breath turning white against the sharp air. He had not slept. Every groan of the timbers in the night, every cry of the wind through the pines had carried the echo of riders approaching. When dawn finally came, it was not relief he felt, but expectation. Ellie stepped into the doorway, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. Her face was pale bruises still fading, but her eyes burned stubborn, refusing to lower even under fear. She looked out across the empty trail, then at him. "They'll come again." Caleb nodded once. "Yes. And when they do, we'll be ready." Her brow furrowed. "Ready how you said you won't raise a gun?" He turned to face her, his voice low, steady. "I won't. But I'll stand. And sometimes standing's harder than shooting." By mid-morning, dust rose on the horizon. 11 riders, again moving in a loose line, rifles slung across their backs, faces drawn hard by duty and doubt. The sheriff was with them. This time, his badge tarnished, his mouth set tight. Caleb stepped out into the yard, arms crossed his shadow long against the frost. He did not move when the men reined in before the cabin. The horses stamped and snorted steam rising from their flanks. The sheriff's eyes flicked to Ellie, who stood in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight, her back straight despite the trembling in her hands. "She's accused," he said. His tone was flat rehearsed, as if he had spoken the line too many times to believe it himself. "Accused of treason of consorting with the enemy." Caleb's voice cut low. "She was left to die. You carved judgment into her skin and called it justice. That's no law I'll bow to." Murmurs stirred among the riders. Some shifted in their saddles, their eyes darting toward the sheriff as if suddenly unsure. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "She has to stand trial." Ellie's voice rose before Caleb could answer. Her words shook, but her spine did not. "I already did. They tied me to a tree and called it a trial. They carved their verdict into my back. If you think I'll kneel again, you don't know what it means to survive." The men fell quiet, her voice ragged as it was carried more truth than their rifles ever could. The sheriff's gaze hardened. His jaw twitched as though he were chewing on guilt he couldn't swallow. He looked back at Caleb. "And you'd claim her. You'd tie your name to hers." Caleb's chest rose, breath sharp, but his words came steady as stone. "She's not theirs to condemn. She's mine to stand beside. If that makes me traitor too, then say it plain." The name passed through the line in hushed tones, Boone, the ghost of the Comanche wars. The scout who had walked through blood and come out the other side carrying shadows. Some of the riders lowered their gazes. Others shifted uncomfortably, rifles sagging in their hands. None raised them. The sheriff leaned forward in his saddle, his voice sharp. "You willing to fight for her?" Caleb didn't blink. "I'll live for her. That's harder." The words rang through the clearing like a bell. The riders stirred uneasily. One muttered, "He means it." Another spat, but his eyes dropped to the dirt. Ellie stepped down from the doorway, then her shawl slipping from her shoulders, the wind tugging at her hair. She moved to Caleb's side, slow but steady, her hand sliding into his. Her voice carried clear across the frost. "I never betrayed this land. I bled for it where no one watched. I loved where they told me not to. If that makes me guilty, then so be it." Her scars burned beneath the bandages, but her eyes held steady. Caleb squeezed her hand, once silent but fierce. The sheriff's gaze swept across them both. Behind him, the men shifted shame, whispering through their line like wind through grass. Some stared at their boots. Some shook their heads. Not one lifted a rifle. At last the sheriff's jaw slackened. He exhaled through his nose long and heavy, then straightened in the saddle. His voice came quieter, almost grudging. "You've made your stand. I won't drag her by rope again." He tipped his hat, the gesture stiff, then turned his horse. The others followed one by one until the clearing was empty save for the crunch of fading hooves. Ellie sagged against Caleb, breath shaking. "They'll talk," she whispered. "They'll whisper louder than ever." Caleb looked down at her, his eyes steady. "Let them whisper. We'll plant louder." She frowned, not understanding. He nodded toward the fields stretching beyond the cabin. Flowers grow where blood once soaked. The ground remembers. So do people. But you choose what grows in the remembering. Her chest ached, but for the first time it wasn't only pain. It was something like hope. That night she sat by the fire, the shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the warmth kissing her scarred back. Caleb sat across from her, sharpening not a knife this time, but a plowshare he'd reforged from old iron, steel that once cut, now meant to till. Ellie watched the sparks leap from the stone. For the first time in a long time, she let herself smile. The cabin grew quiet again after the sheriff's departure, but it was not the same silence as before. This quiet was heavier, as if the air itself knew something had shifted. Ellie sat near the fire, her shawl draped across her shoulders, eyes fixed on the flames that licked at the blackened logs. Her body trembled still, not from cold, but from the echo of voices that had nearly carried her away. Caleb sat on the bench by the door, arms crossed, gaze steady on the ground. He hadn't spoken since the riders left. The weight of what had passed pressed deep into him, stirring memories he had long buried. Ellie finally broke the silence. "They didn't take me. Not this time." Her voice was fragile, as if she barely believed it herself. Caleb lifted his eyes, meeting hers. "They won't." Her lips parted, unsure whether to believe him. "They will try again. People like that don't forget." He leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees. "You're right, they don't forget. But neither do I." His voice was gravel-worn but steady. "I've spent years chasing ghosts. Tonight I saw men turn back from their own shadows. That's not forgetting. That's shame. Shame lingers longer than hate." Ellie's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but her body still remembered the rope that knifed the jail. Her scars itched with phantom pain. Shame didn't stop them before. "No," Caleb admitted, "but it stopped them tonight. And tonight is enough to reach tomorrow." The days that followed brought small mercies. The frost thawed under sun. The soil softened, ready to be turned. Caleb worked outside, mending fences, splitting wood, tilling the patch of ground that clung stubborn near the cabin. Ellie joined him when she could, moving stiff but determined. At first she only carried kindling, fetched water, small tasks her body could bear, but each step she took outside was its own victory. One afternoon she paused by the field where Caleb dug furrows. Sweat slicked his brow, his shirt clinging to muscle and scar alike. He worked with a rhythm that spoke of penance, each thrust of the spade more than labor, it was confession. She called out softly, "You work like the earth owes you something." He leaned on the spade, wiping his brow with the back of his arm. "Maybe it does. Maybe I owe it." Her lips curved faintly, the closest she'd come to a smile in weeks. "Which is it?" He shrugged. "Doesn't matter long as something grows." Ellie stepped closer, her shawl tugged by the wind. "I used to plant marigolds with my mother. She said they kept the worms away. Bright orange, stubborn little flowers. They always came back, no matter how much we forgot them." Caleb glanced at her eyes, narrowing softly. "Maybe we should plant marigolds then." Her heart tightened at the words, not for the flowers, but for the simple truth tucked inside a man who once buried knives, now speaking of planting seeds. That night, Ellie sat by the fire, her hands busy stitching torn linen. Caleb sat opposite, mending tack, the room alive with the quiet sounds of needle through cloth thread, pulling tight leather creaking under his grip. Ellie glanced up, her voice breaking the rhythm. "They carved me because of love." Her hands shook on the fabric. They wanted me to scream to regret it, but I didn't. Not once. Caleb's hands stilled. His gaze rose steady, unreadable. "You still don't." She shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. "I love Tasso. I'll carry that, even if it kills me. But love isn't shame. Not then, not now." The words burned out of her raw and trembling but steady at the core. Caleb leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his voice low. "They wanted to brand you with their word. You branded yourself with truth instead. That's what they saw in the clearing. That's what made them falter." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, her eyes dropped, a tear sliding unbidden down her cheek. She let it fall, not bothering to hide it this time. The next day, two neighbors appeared at the edge of the field. Not riders with rifles, but settlers Caleb had once traded with before turning ghost. They came slow, hesitant, as though approaching a fire they weren't sure would burn or warm. Caleb stood from the furrow, spade in hand. Ellie froze near the cabin, her pulse racing. The older of the two men tipped his hat. "Boone," he said carefully, "word's gone round. Some say you've gone soft. Some say you've gone mad. We came to see which it is." Caleb's face was carved in stone. "Maybe both." The man's eyes flicked to Ellie, then back to him. "She's still here." Caleb nodded. "She's alive. That's all that matters." The men exchanged glances. At last the younger one muttered, "Ain't our business then." They turned, walking back the way they came. Ellie exhaled slowly, her hands loosening their grip on her shawl. Her eyes found Caleb's. "They're watching," she whispered. "They'll always watch." Caleb leaned on the spade, sweat glistening in the sun. "Then let them watch us plant." That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hills in copper light, Ellie knelt beside the furrows Caleb had dug. Her hands shook as she tucked small seeds into the soil herb's roots. A few flower seeds she had kept hidden in her pocket since before the raid. Her voice was low, almost prayerful. "They said I was nothing, but even nothing can grow." Caleb stood over her silent, the earth clinging to his palms. For the first time in years, he believed it. The spring thaw came slow dripping from the eaves, softening the earth until the cabin yard smelled of wet soil and pine. Everywhere Caleb looked, the land seemed restless, eager to be made new. He rose each morning with the sun breaking the ground with steady strokes, sweat soaking through his shirt, even in the chill air. Each swing of the hoe felt less like punishment, now more like a vow. Ellie joined him more often. At first she only knelt, pressing seeds into the furrows with careful fingers. Her back still burned, but she bore it with clenched teeth and stubborn silence. Over time she straightened more easily, her step steadying as the scars hardened. One morning, as she watered the rows with a tin dipper, Caleb watched her from the woodpile. The wind lifted strands of her hair, framing her face in the pale gold of sunrise. For a moment she didn't look like the broken woman he had carried from the tree. She looked like someone rising. He set the axe aside, walking toward her. "You plant straight rows," he said. Her lips curved faintly. "My mother taught me. She said straight rows make a straight life." She looked up at him, eyes glinting with something close to mischief. Not sure it worked out that way. Caleb's chest tightened, not with pain, but with something he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to smile, but the memory of Anna's laugh and Jacob's small hands lingered, ghosting the edges of his mind. His voice came rough. "Straight life's a lie anyhow. Nothing grows without bending." Ellie held his gaze a moment longer before dropping it back to the soil. Her fingers dug another hole, pressing the seeds deep. Then let it bend. Maybe bent things last longer. That evening, the cabin smelled of stew venison beans, wild onions Ellie had gathered by the creek. The scent filled the air with something Caleb hadn't known in years' comfort. He sat at the table listening to her hum faintly under her breath as she stirred the pot. It was no tune he recognized, but it wound through the cabin, soft as smoke curling into corners that had long been empty. He found himself speaking without planning it. "My boy, Jacob." He used to hum, always nonsense sounds, said it made the horses run faster when he rode the fence rail. Ellie glanced over her shoulder, wooden spoon in hand. Her eyes softened. What happened to him? Caleb's throat worked. He forced the words past it. "Raiders. Middle of the night. I buried him with Anna. I was a mile away with a rifle in my hands and still too far." Ellie turned back to the pot, her shoulders stiff. Her voice came quiet. "My baby never drew a breath. But I buried him too in my own way. Named him without a grave." The two silences met in the cabin, grief woven together like threads in the same cloth. The fire hissed. The stew bubbled. And for once, neither felt alone in carrying it. The next week, neighbors returned. Not to threaten this time, but to watch from the ridge as Caleb and Ellie bent over the soil. They lingered, whispering among themselves. Some shook their heads, others only stared. None came closer. Ellie's hands trembled as she pressed another sprig into the dirt. "They'll never stop watching," she murmured. Caleb straightened, sweat glistening on his brow, his voice steady. "Then let them see more than scars. Let them see what grows." Her throat tightened. She wiped dirt on her skirt, blinking hard against tears that came not from pain, but from the weight of being seen finally on her own terms. One evening, after long work in the fields, Ellie stepped outside alone. The air was crisp, stars scattered bright across the sky. She tilted her face upward, letting the night wind cool her scars. Behind her, Caleb leaned in the doorway, arms folded, watching. He cleared his throat, voice low. "You look like him when you do that." She turned puzzled. "Who Tasso?" "The way you said he looked at the sky like it held answers." He nodded at her. "You do the same." Her heart jolted. For the first time, the name didn't pierce her like a blade. It settled soft as though spoken with respect. Her voice wavered, but she met his gaze. And you, what do you see when you look up? Caleb hesitated. Then he lifted his head, staring at the endless dark pricked with stars. I see a sky big enough to bury hate, big enough to start over. Her lips trembled, her hand pressing against the shawl at her chest. For a long moment they stood under the same stars, the silence between them no longer jagged but wide, carrying possibility. The fields grew. Sprigs of green pierced through soil once soaked with blood. Ellie bent to touch the first tender shoots, her fingers trembling with awe. Life, she whispered. They thought they ended me, but here it is anyway. Caleb knelt beside her, his rough hand brushing the same leaf. His voice was gravel but soft. You ended nothing, Ellie. You began. The two of them knelt there in the dirt, side by side, the cabin behind them, the wide sky above. And for the first time since the oak tree, Ellie believed tomorrow might belong to her. Summer settled over the hills with a weight that pressed heat into the soil and stretched daylight deep into the evening. The cabin no longer stood as a shadow of exile. It breathed now, alive with the smell of fresh bread. Herbs hung from rafters, rows of young plants clawing their way skyward outside. Ellie's scars had begun to knit closed pink ridges beneath the bandages, though each movement still reminded her of pain. She bore it with the same stubbornness she bore everything with clenched jaw with quiet fire. Each day she walked farther from the cabin down toward the creek, her hands learning again how to gather, how to live. Caleb worked the fields, his back bent under the sun, sweat tracing paths down the map of old scars across his shoulders. Every stroke of the hoe cut not only earth, but memory digging deeper than soil into years of violence he was trying to replace with growth. One evening after long hours in the fields, Caleb sat sharpening a plow blade at the table. Ellie stitched cloth by the fire, her hair lit gold by the flames. The rhythm of their work made the cabin feel less like a cage, more like a home. She broke the quiet first. Do you still dream of them? Your wife, your boy. Caleb's hands stilled on the blade. He didn't look up right away. Yes. His voice rasped like gravel. Some nights I hear Anna laugh, and it feels like I can breathe again. Some nights I hear Jacob cry, and I wake with my hands clenched so tight I bleed. Ellie lowered her sewing to her lap, her breath trembling. I dream of Tasso, too. Not of his death, of him sitting by a fire, teaching me words I barely understood. He touched his chest once, said, I was not a thing. I was someone's sky. I thought he was foolish. Her lips trembled. Now I think he was the only one who saw me. Caleb met her eyes, the fire reflecting in both their gazes. I see you, he said simply. Ellie's throat tightened. For a moment she wanted to turn away, but instead she let the words settle into her warm, frightening necessary. The next day neighbors came again. 2 women this time carrying baskets. They lingered near the field uncertain. Ellie stood frozen by the rows, her heart pounding, waiting for insult, for whispers. But one of the women set the basket down, beans, flour, a slab of salt pork. She didn't meet Ellie's eyes, only muttered, for trade. If you've got herbs to spare. Ellie's mouth opened, stunned. Her hands shook as she gathered sprigs of sage and yarrow from the line drying near the door. When she handed them over, the woman's gaze flicked up brief sharp, then away again. No blessing, no curse, only acknowledgement. After they left, Ellie sagged against the cabin wall, her breath shuddering. Caleb came to her side, his hand hovering but not touching. You stood, he said softly. They didn't spit. Her voice cracked. That's the first time since... She couldn't finish. Caleb nodded once. Change comes slower than hate. But it comes. Weeks passed. The plants grew taller, the field a patchwork of green, where once the soil had drunk only blood. Ellie knelt among them, her belly pressing faint against the fabric of her dress. Caleb noticed before she said it aloud. One evening, as cicadas hummed in the trees and the air smelled of rain, Ellie placed his hand against her stomach. Her voice shook. It's early still. But I know. I feel it. Caleb's hand froze, rough palm trembling where it rested. His breath caught his chest, heaving with something he hadn't let himself feel in years, hope laced sharp with fear. He looked at her, his voice breaking. "You're sure?" She nodded, eyes glistening. "This time, I'm sure." He lowered his forehead to hers, closing his eyes. "I buried the knife," he whispered. "Now we plant seeds." The months rolled forward, each one carrying both fear and promise. Ellie's belly rounded, her steps slowed, but her spirit hardened with new steel. At night, she spoke to the life inside her, whispering truths she'd never been allowed to speak aloud before. "You are not shame," she said. "You are not a word carved by hate. You are mine." Caleb listened in silence, his chest tight. He mended the fence, patched the roof, split enough wood for winter, every action driven not by survival alone, but by the fierce knowledge that something new waited to be born beneath that roof. One stormy night, thunder cracked the sky open. Rain hammered the roof like fists. Ellie gripped Caleb's hand, pain tearing through her body. Her cries rose against the storm, wild and raw, but steady, with determination. Caleb boiled water, laid out cloth, his hands trembling, but precise. He knelt beside her forehead, pressed to hers. "Promise me," she gasped. "This child will never bleed for someone else's war." His voice cracked, breaking open. "I promise. We bury the knife, Ellie. We don't pass it on." And when the child's cry rose above the storm, sharp and alive, it was not just birth, it was resurrection. They named him Jonah. Not for profit, but for a story swallowed by death returned to life. The morning after the storm, the air smelled of sage and wet earth. Ellie lay exhausted, but smiling, the baby at her breast. Caleb sat nearby, eyes, wet hands shaking as he reached to touch his son's tiny fist. No songs, no monuments, just the sound of rain dripping from the eaves and the quiet miracle of life in a place once haunted by death. The cabin had never known such sound before. Jonah's cries filled the air, sharp and insistent, demanding to be heard. Ellie rocked him against her chest, exhaustion etched in the lines of her face, but her eyes glowed with something stronger than weariness. Caleb stood nearby, awkward at first, as if the sight of a new life in his home might vanish if he stepped too close. At last Ellie looked up, voice soft but steady. "Hold him." Caleb froze. His hands, scarred heavy, made for steel, felt unworthy. But Ellie extended the child toward him, her eyes unyielding. Slowly, carefully, he took Jonah into his arms. The baby was impossibly small. His skin warm, his breath a feather against Caleb's neck. Caleb's chest tightened, memories flooding Jacob at 3, laughing at horses he thought were dragons. The grief threatened to crush him. But then Jonah's tiny hand curled around his finger, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt something other than ghosts. Ellie watched her lips trembling into a smile. "You look like you've carried him all your life." Caleb swallowed, his voice rough. "I only ever carried death. This is different." The days grew longer with Jonah in the cabin. His cries woke them in the dark hours, his laughter filled the mornings. Ellie moved slower, her body healing, but her spirit sharpened with every sound her child made. She would not let the world call him shame. She would not let the word carved into her back touch him. Caleb worked harder than he ever had. He mended fences, tilled deeper furrows, built a cradle from pine. He cut himself. At night, when Jonah finally slept, Caleb sat beside the cradle, staring down at the boy's tiny chest rising and falling. The firelight caught his face, softening scars, making him look less like a soldier and more like a father. Ellie often watched from the cot, her heart aching with gratitude and fear in equal measure. "You've given him more than I thought he'd ever have," she whispered one night. Caleb shook his head. "He gave me more than I deserved." But whispers still carried across the ridges. Neighbors came, some curious, some skeptical. They lingered at the edge of the field, muttering about the girl who had lain with a savage, the man who had once carved vengeance into the plains. Now they spoke of the child, whether he was a curse or a miracle. One afternoon, a rider stopped at the fence. He was a stranger, his coat too fine, his boots polished clean. Suspicion clung to him like dust. He looked down at Ellie, who stood with Jonah in her arms, flowers clutched in the boy's tiny fist. "You're the woman who married a killer," the man said. Ellie's spine stiffened. She kissed Jonah's head, then looked the stranger square in the eye. "I'm the woman he chose to live beside. And this child is the only thing we've both sworn never to lose." The rider studied her, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. At last he tipped his hat and rode on. Ellie held Jonah tighter, her heart pounding, but pride thrummed in her veins. For the first time she had spoken not in defense, but in truth. That night, as dusk fell and the land glowed amber, Caleb knelt by the oak tree where the knife lay buried. Ellie joined him, Jonah cradled in her arms. White flowers bloomed where the steel had once gleamed, wild and stubborn. Caleb pressed his palm into the soil. He did not speak, but Ellie laid her hand over his Jonah's small fist between them. The three of them stayed that way until the stars pricked open the sky. At last, Caleb whispered, "I will not lift another blade unless it's to protect. Not him, not you." Ellie's eyes glistened. "Then let the past stay buried." The wind stirred the branches above, soft and forgiving. Jonah stirred in her arms, his tiny cry breaking the silence. Ellie smiled, pressing her lips to his hair. "Even the earth knows new names," she murmured. Caleb rose, wrapping his arm around them both. And beneath that oak, once a monument of cruelty, a family began to root. The summer stretched forward, fields thick with green flowers, bursting yellow and white, where no blood remained. Jonah grew strong, laughter spilling across the hills, his little feet pattering in the dirt. Neighbors no longer whispered as sharply. Some even came to trade to sit at the table to taste Ellie's bread and Caleb's harvest. The scars on Ellie's back remained, but they no longer bled. They no longer owned her. Each time she bent to lift her son, each time she stood beside Caleb in the fields, the word they had carved faded further into history. The oak tree still bore its rope marks, but beneath it flowers spread wider every season, stubborn reminders that life once planted refuses to be silenced. Autumn rolled in with a blaze of color, painting the ridges in copper and gold. The air grew crisp, the fields heavy with harvest. Caleb worked from dawn until dusk, his broad hands coaxing food from soil that had once known only ash. Ellie gathered herbs, baked bread, dried roots for winter. Jonah toddled between them, his laugh scattering across the yard like birds startled from a fence. The cabin no longer felt like a hermit's refuge. It felt lived-in bread, cooling on the table, shirts drying by the hearth. Small toys Caleb had whittled from pine scattered near the cradle. Life had come fierce and stubborn. But the past did not die easy. One evening, as dusk bruised the horizon, Caleb spotted riders on the ridge again. Not 11 this time. 3. They reined in near the field, their silhouettes dark against the sky. Ellie froze at the sight. Jonah clutched tight to her chest. Her scars seemed to burn beneath her dress. Caleb stepped forward, his shoulders straight, his voice even. "What do you want?" The leader spat into the dirt. His voice was sharp with scorn. "Word spread far, Boone. You let a Comanche's whore into your house, into your bed. Now you've bred her shame into a child. You think the land'll forgive that?" Ellie's breath hitched, her eyes burning, but she held her ground. Caleb didn't move, didn't flinch. His voice came low thunder, steady on the horizon. "I buried the knife. If you came looking for blood, you'll leave with nothing but shame." The man sneered. "You won't fight." "Then you're already dead." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Dead men don't plant fields. Dead men don't raise sons." "I've done both." The words carried heavier than gunfire. For a moment, silence swallowed the clearing. The riders shifted uneasily. One muttered, "He means it." Another spat, looking away. At last the leader jerked his reins. "You'll regret it, Boone. Both of you." They turned and rode back into the twilight, their threat trailing like smoke. Ellie sagged against the fence, clutching Jonah. Her voice trembled. "They'll never let us live." Caleb stepped close, his hand steady on her shoulder. "They already have. Every seed we plant, every laugh that boy makes, it's life. And life is louder than hate." That night Ellie couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, Jonah breathing soft in his cradle. Caleb dozed in the rocker, his rifle within reach, though it stayed untouched. Ellie whispered into the flames, more to herself than to him. "I was meant to be a warning, a scar carved into a tree for others to fear. But here I am, breathing, sowing, planting, loving." Caleb stirred, half awake, his voice rough. "And that's what frightens them most." She turned to him, eyes glistening. "They'll never call me Ellie again. Not in town. Not in their prayers." He leaned forward, gaze burning. "They don't get to name you. You've already named yourself." Her chest ached, but the words sank deep, solid as roots. For the first time, she felt the truth of them. Winter came early. Snow draped the cabin roof, the fields sleeping beneath white silence. Caleb chopped wood. Jonah bundled on his back in a sling, laughing every time the axe cracked through a log. Ellie watched from the doorway, her shawl pulled tight, her heart swelling at the sight. The past lingered, yes. Whispers still carried on the wind, but each day was proof they were more than what had been done to them. And under the oak where a knife once lay, flowers still bloomed stubborn beneath the frost reminders that even in the coldest season, life endures. Spring returned with a gentleness neither of them had expected. The thaw came slow, but the earth woke, and so did they. Jonah toddled barefoot through the mud fists full of wildflowers. He thrust at Ellie with fierce pride. She bent to take them, her scars pulling but no longer raw, her smile bright as the morning sun. Caleb mended the fence line, his axe forgotten in favor of nails and rope. He no longer sharpened steel at night. He carved toys, mended tools, patched Jonah's little shoes. The cabin echoed not with silence, but with laughter, with the creak of the rocker, with the bubbling of stew that never ran out. One evening, as dusk painted the sky purple and gold, they walked together to the oak. The tree stood tall, its bark-scarred roots deep. But at its base, where the knife lay buried, wildflowers spread in a stubborn crown, white yellow violet refusing to die. Ellie knelt, her hand brushing the blooms. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. I thought this tree would haunt me forever. Her voice trembled, then steadied. But it doesn't anymore. It reminds me I lived. Caleb crouched beside her, Jonah squirming against his chest. His voice was gravel soft. You did more than live. You turned the mark they gave you into a garden. Ellie reached for his hand, their fingers lacing together. Her scars still burned in the night, but now they were not chains. They were proof. As Jonah played in the grass, Caleb spoke, his tone low, certain. I'll never raise a blade against this world again, unless it's to protect you. To protect him. Ellie turned to him, her eyes fierce, forgiving, unbroken. Then let the past stay buried. The wind stirred through the branches soft as a hymn. The air smelled of sage and rain, not blood. And for the first time both of them believed it. The town never fully forgot. Some whispered still, but others came quietly to trade to learn the herbs Ellie grew to ask Caleb for help mending a fence or breaking a stubborn horse. Whispers turned to silence, and silence slowly, stubbornly turned to respect. Jonah grew fast, his feet chasing butterflies across the hills, his voice carrying across the ridges like a bell. To him, the scars on his mother's back meant nothing. To him, his father's silence was not grief, but strength. He knew only love. Years later, beneath that same oak, Ellie and Caleb stood side by side. Jonah tall now, his hands steady on the reins of his first horse. The flowers bloomed thicker than ever, a wild, defiant garden. Ellie placed her hand on the soil. Her voice was soft but strong. Some wounds carved deeper than flesh. Some names are meant not to shame, but to remind us how love survives where it is least welcome. Caleb bent his rough hand, covering hers. His voice cracked, but his words carried clear. And we chose to plant, not to cut. They rose together, their sun between them, the oak behind the horizon wide ahead. No monuments, no sermons, only the truth written in earth and scar and laughter and seed in the silence of a buried knife. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.